So hello, everyone. Do you hear me? Yes, okay. So good evening and guten Morgen and bonjour. So I'm Euree, a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy, Kyunghee University here in Seoul. It's a great honor for me to chair the final plenary session. And I'm very pleased to introduce our guest from Dublin, Dominic J. He is a professor emeritus at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Professor O'Mara is one of the pioneering scholars in the field of ancient Platonism. To mention just a few of his publications. First, Plotinus, An Introduction to the Aeneas, which was translated also into Korean. Oh, okay. I'll show you. So this book. And the second, Platonopolis, Platonic Political Philosophy in Late Antiquity. And finally, so he published recently a book titled with Cosmology and Politics in Plato's Later Works. So I can show you. Okay. So this is Platonopolis, and this is the recent book, so on Plato. The recent book includes studies relevant for the topic that he is going to talk about today, namely the architectural image of the world in Plato's Timaeus. Please join me in welcoming Professor O'Mara with a big hand.
Thank you very much, Euree. Before giving my talk, I think as I am making the last presentation at this wonderful conference, that I might be able to speak on behalf of all of us, all the participants in the conference, to thank the organizers of this conference very much for all that they have done. A very big 감사합니다. Also thanks to our Asian colleagues who have organized this meeting of the IPS. It has been wonderfully done. I can only repeat the nice things that William Altman has said about the perfect way in which things have been organized, given especially the very difficult circumstances in which we find ourselves at the moment. I'm wondering if Plato, in his image of the cave, was proleptically thinking of us now, confined as we are, prisoners as we are of our own little caves. We are like, so to speak, troglodytes or high-tech cave dwellers. We're all stuck behind our screens, watching little flickering shadows of people on our screens and listening to echoes of their voices. But I think this conference has taught us that, in Plato at least, images are not necessarily negative things. They can be positive things. They can lead us out of the cave. And so we can hope, of course, that one day we will see each other, our real selves, in a real world and talk to each other and maybe even have a coffee or something to drink together. And we can also hope maybe one day to go to Seoul, to this fantastic metropolis full of beautiful palaces, beautiful temples, beautiful museums. So I think there is some hope that although we're working with images, maybe we'll see the reality of ourselves and of Seoul later. So I think I shall start to try to give my talk. And to do that, I'm going to try to call up the text. Where is it? Here. There. Have you got my text?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so I'll just read it. It's not too long. So at the end of his speech in Plato's Timaeus, Timaeus describes the cosmos as a perceptible God, image of the intelligible. We can relate this statement to the beginning of Timaeus' speech, where he refers to the intelligible model, paradigma, used by the Demiurge in making the world, a world which is an image of its model. The cosmos is then a perceptible image of its intelligible model. But in what way precisely, we may ask, is the world an image of its model? What is it which makes it to be an image of its model? In this paper, I would like to propose an answer to these questions. I will not primarily be concerned with a theory or theories of images in Plato, but simply with the question as to what it means for the world to be an image of its intelligible model. The approach I would like to adopt in dealing with this question is the following. I will come back to the beginning of Timaeus' speech, where the relationship of image and model as regards the cosmos is introduced. Timaeus here is telling the story of the making of the world. According to the, according to the story, a god, the Demiurge, made the world by using the best model for this purpose. The Demiurge, in his world-making activities, evokes the practice of a range of different arts and crafts, for example, sculpting, metalworking, painting, as well as political or legislative functions. However, I would like to concentrate in this paper on one aspect of the Demiurge's cosmological functions, his activity as architect of the world. I would like to show in detail in what ways the Demiurge functions as the architect of the world, and will ask to what extent this architectural image of the making of the world might help us, in certain respects, identify the way in which the world is an image of its intelligible model. In a recent book to which Euree referred, I have already discussed architectural aspects of the cosmology of Plato's Timaeus. Here I would like to develop the theme in much more detail, to the extent that it bears on the question of the status of the world as image of an intelligible model. In the first part of the paper, I will describe the main steps in a major architectural project as it was carried out in classical Greece. In the second part, I will show how the Demiurge acts in the Timaeus in ways corresponding to the architectural procedures listed in the first part of the paper, thus acting as architect of the world. Finally, in the third part, conclusions will be inferred as to what the architectural image of the making of the world might tell us about the way in which the world is an image of its intelligible model. So first, architectural procedures in classical Greece. Drawing both from literary sources, including Plato, and from information provided by inscriptions relating to building projects on the Athenian Acropolis, on the sacred island of Delos, and elsewhere, we might distinguish the following stages in the execution of major public building programs such as temples, other public buildings, and statues. I refer to bibliography, which you'll find at the end of the paper. It's all architectural bibliography, not Plato bibliography mostly. So first, in these procedures, the initial decision to construct a public building, a decision taken by the people of Athens or by another city or perhaps by a king, tyrant, or rich patron, could involve a call for the submission of projects by local or external architects. Even ordinary citizens could submit a project in the case of the Temple of Athena Nike on the Athenian Acropolis, as indicated in an inscription dated to the 420s. In this case, the project, gramma, submitted by a citizen was to measure at least a cubit and to be displayed in public for 10 days before the council could judge its acceptance, having received the opinions of citizens and allies. The submitted project, called a paradigma, could take the form of an oral presentation, logos, or of a sketch, or of lines or shapes traced on a wax tablet. The terms used for this are gramma, as in the above inscription, diagramma, upadigma, upographe. And then I referred to Hellman, This is Marie-Christine Hellman, her vocabulary of the Greek architect as based on the inscriptions of Delos. It's in the bibliography, and for me it has become almost a Bible. You find lots of terminology in this dictionary of architectural vocabulary from the inscriptions in Delos, which are relevant to understanding better the Timaeus. So in the following, I just refer to H. Hellman for the relevant pages where you will find the term describes as it was used by architects. So you have this vocabulary: gramma, diagramma, hypodeigma, hypographe. The initial project was not a full-scale model. A summary project was adequate for the purposes of making an initial decision, since the standardization of classical Greek architecture meant that brief indications of styles and dimensions were enough for the visualization of the final product. And here there's an interesting passage in Plato's Republic, which I quote: "To sketch the shape of the constitution without working it out in detail, apergasestai, for even from a sketch, hypographe, we shall discern the most just and the most unjust man, and it would be an intolerably long task to describe every kind of city and every kind of character without omitting any detail." You see the term hypographe there. In Athens, the submitted project would be voted on by the assembly or council, which could consult a municipal architect on the matter. Plato again talks about this in the Protagoras, I quote: "Now, when we meet in the assembly, then if the state is faced with some building project, I observe that architects are sent for and consulted about the proposed structures." Next step, a commission was appointed and charged with supervising the execution of the project, in particular, financial control of the project as it evolved. Detailed contracts, sumgraphai, were established and awarded to various contractors, ergo laboi. Plato also uses this term, and craftsmen. The architect whose project was accepted supervised its execution by the workmen and saw to the completion apergatestai of the construction work. See Plato's Statesman. I don't quote the passage, but of course I think you know it. The emphasis is placed in this passage of the statement on the difference between the architect, architekton, who directs the work on the basis of his knowledge, and the workman, the architect assigning the appropriate task to the workman and seeing to its completion. This is the directive architectonic role which both Plato and Aristotle give to political science. As the work progressed, the architect continued his designing work, drawing up measured plans, since the initial project was just a general sketch. Measured plans traced in stone have been found in the Temple of Apollo at Didyma and at the Temple of Athena at Priene. These plans vary in detail, going from preliminary fleeting sketches to much more detailed drawings which could serve as building plans for the workers. In planning the construction work, the architect would establish a measure, Vitruvius calls it the modulus, of varying length as a unit in order to calculate the proportions of the building. Interestingly, here also Plato in the Philebus refers to such a thing, a metron, and to instruments of measuring used by carpenters and stonemasons. A fleeting sketch from Priene is thought to represent, with the 6 lines at the right of the bottom, the proportions between the column diameters and the space between the columns. If you look at the sketch, I think you have it now. If you look at the bottom, you've got 7 lines going up, and the 6 lines to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yes, you'll see that the distances are roughly 8, 12, 8, 13, 8. And the historian, the archaeologist who has excavated the temple at Priene, thinks that these represent distances, the diameter of columns, the 8 distance, and then the distance between each column, the 12 or 13 distance. This is not obviously a plan to be followed by the workers. It's just a preliminary sketch of distances, relations between components of the building. I'm also very interested in the lines, which we cannot really decipher as to their meaning, just above where you have lines cut and segmented in various ways. Furthermore, going on, the architect prepared prototypes, which were also called paradigmata, for specific parts of the building. For example, prototypes of roof tiles or of heads of columns for the craftsmen to copy. We still have examples of such prototypes. You can look at Coulton for these examples. We must therefore distinguish, and I want to emphasize this, between the term paradigm, as designating a preliminary project, Entwurf in German, and the term paradigma as concerning a prototype to be replicated. Of course, the execution of the building project was subject to all sorts of varying conditions affecting its progress and completion. The project could take many years, even centuries to complete. Architects could be replaced as well as their planning. Building teams could change, financial arrangements could become a problem, and so on. We might add that Plato provides a detailed description of a temple in the Critias, that of Poseidon, built in Atlantis, according to the mythical story told in the Timaeus and Critias. This temple was of truly gigantic proportions, 600 feet by 300 by 150. I'm assuming the proportion of 2 to 1 in the last case. Perhaps Plato might have been inspired by the colossal temples built in Selinus and Akragas in Sicily. However, the proportions seem very crude, 2 to 1, as compared to the more refined ones used in Greek temples. For the Parthenon, the corresponding proportion is 9 to 4. This has been explained as intended to suggest a barbaric monumentality in the temple in Atlantis. Second part of the paper, the Demiurge as architect of the world and the Timaeus. Turning now to the activities of the divine Demiurge in the cosmology of the Timaeus, we can note the following architectural features, and then I had references to the corresponding parts in the architectural procedures I listed. And then you can sort of make the relation between them. First, the Demiurge, ho tektai nomenos, makes use of the best model in making the world. Taken by itself, this feature does not necessarily indicate architectural practice, since models can also be used in other arts and skills, such as painting, sculpting, and weaving. But as being part of a set of other features which I mention next, belonging to architectural practice, it points in this direction. I think this corresponds to the preliminary project, paradigma in the first sense. The Demiurge assigns cosmological work to subordinates and instructs them on these delegated tasks. They are the young gods. I come back to their work below. Plato gives us the rare privilege of listening in on the speech whereby the divine architect gives instructions to his cosmic craftsmen. Perhaps I'll just skip the quotation, but it's quite interesting. Third, the language of construction is used for the Demiurge's work. And then I give a list of terms, and for each case you have the corresponding passage in Hellman's vocabulary of the Greek architect in the inscriptions of Delos, apergadzistai. There may even be a very technical sense in the last occurrence, which Hellman describes, exergadzistai, sun apergadzistai, and then the phrase suntektaineto arestonto ergon apergassamenos. And then the words ergon and ergasia can have the sense of construction. You can find this in Hellman and also in Plato's Republic. The Demiurge measures out soul material, seems to be two-dimensional, into segments constituting mathematical intervals. He does this by taking a portion of it, of the soul material, Moira, and then alternately doubling and tripling the portion, an operation which produces geometrical progressions and proportions or equalities. The portion, Moira, I think, functions as a metron, the modulus I referred to in Vitruvius before. Doubling and tripling the portion produces commensurability, symmetria, proportions. At the end of the paper, I can go quickly to the end. I've sort of sketched this out. You got the portion, Moira, which is the first segment, 1. And then above, this segment is multiplied by 2, so you get the series 2, 4, 8. And then below, multiplied by 3, you get the series 3, 9, and so on. I didn't have enough space on my page to put the last number for the tripling. And this gives, by doubling the measure, the series 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and by tripling the measure 1 to 3, 3 to 9, 9 to 27. Okay, so let's come back to where we were. Yes, okay. To these proportions are added arithmetical and harmonic proportions, which I give there in terms of formulas. The three types of proportions or equalities produce identity, the same ratios in geometrical and harmonic proportions, the same quantities in arithmetical proportion. These structures serve to bind soul, bind desmos. Mathematical structures, geometrical figures also serve to give form to the 4 elements. The Demiurge uses the circular shape of the world as a prototype for making the celestial bodies. At least that's my interpretation. This is paradigma in the second sense, the sense of prototype. It should be added that the Demiurge also functions sometimes in a way that evokes the practice of other crafts and skills, for example, metalworking and painting. The young gods, carrying out the tasks assigned to them by the Demiurge, also build. He instructs them abergaste, and they build dioi kodomi santes. They work as carpenters, gluing, sune kolon, the elements together to make bodies, using invisible dowels, gompsoi. You can find this, all of this in Hellman, in our vocabulary of the Greek architect. I quote, they borrowed portions of fire and earth and water and air from the world, which were hereafter to be restored. These they took and glued them together, not with the indissoluble clamps, desmoi, by which they themselves were bound, but with little dowels, gompsoi, too small to be visible, producing abergadzonanoi out of all the 4 elements, each separate body. End of quote. In building terminology, one can distinguish between desmoi as bonds or clamps binding stones horizontally to each other, and gompsoi as dowels binding vertically, also used in carpentry. The young gods also appeared to use the spherical shape of the universe as a prototype, paradigma in the second sense, for making heads. Quote, first then the gods, imitating the spherical sphere of the universe, enclosed the 2 divine courses of the soul in a spherical body, that namely which we now term the head. End quote. Summing up these points, we could conclude that the universe is presented in Plato's Timaeus as if it were a construction produced by a divine architect who makes use of the best of models, establishing a measure for calculating proportions, measuring out these proportions, using prototypes, delegating subordinate work to his children, the young gods, who work as craftsmen and who bring the work to completion. The cosmic construction is built on a foundation, hedra, but a foundation not like any other in its indefiniteness and instability, certainly not the foundation that any human architect would want to use, just as the cosmos itself is something absolutely unique. So I come to the last part of my paper. As I have indicated above, the action of the demiurge of the world is also described in terms of arts and crafts other than architecture, where he functions as various sorts of craftsmen. However, I think we can say that the architectural image of the making of the world is quite prominent, at least in the earlier part of Timaeus' cosmological story. Concentrating then on the architectural image, we might examine what this image might indicate as to the way in which the perceptible cosmos is itself an image of its intelligible paradigm. A first point which might be made is that the intelligible paradigm, according to the architectural image, will not be a model in the sense of being a prototype to be simply duplicated in the perceptible world. The Demiurge and the young gods do indeed use such perceptible prototypes, the spherical shape of the world, in making perceptible bodies. But the intelligible paradigm of the world, interpreted in the context of architectural practice, corresponds rather to an initial project, which in architectural procedure merely gives summary indications as to styles and dimensions of the planned building. The implication of this is that the perceptible world is not a copy of its model in the sense of being simply a duplicate of the intelligible. The two-world theory attributed in the tradition to Plato, according to which the sensible, perceptible world replicates an intelligible world, is not consistent with the architectural image of the world as produced on the basis of a model which represents a project or preliminary sketch, not a prototype. The making of the world, according to the intelligible paradigm, involves on the part of the Demiurge the use of measured plans integrating mathematical, in particular, geometrical structures. In what way then do these structures translate or express the intelligible paradigm in the constitution of the world? A point I have mentioned above is that the proportions used by the Demiurge all involve types of equality, geometrical, arithmetic, and harmonic, and that these types correspond to relations of identity, identity of ratios and identity of quantities. Identity finds expression in the perceptible world in structures producing different sorts of equality. And here I quote, "Of all bonds, Desmoid, the most beautiful is that which makes itself and the terms it connects a unity in the fullest sense, and it is of the nature of a geometrical proportion to produce this most beautifully. For as the first term is to the middle, so is it itself to the last." So all the terms of the proportion come to be necessarily identical to auta. And in becoming identical to each other, they will all make a unity. End of quote. Identity, I infer, is given in the intelligible paradigm. Equality is a structure which serves to express identity in the perceptible world. In virtue of the equalities which bind it, the perceptible world is an image of identity in its intelligible paradigm. In this book I referred to, I have tried to show how various other properties of the world, for example, all-inclusiveness, self-sufficiency, perpetuity, find their equivalents, not their duplicates, in the intelligible world. Intelligible model, sorry, intelligible model, not a world. The eternity of the paradigm is expressed in the perpetuity of the world. The perfect completeness of the paradigm is translated in the organic self-sufficiency of the world, which is a spherical, self-recycling animal, needing no intake from outside and having no output. Identity is found, together with difference and being, in the intelligible, and they are used by the Demiurge as ingredients in making soul material. We may thus infer that difference and being should also find expression in the constitution of the world in terms of corresponding features. Difference would most obviously be found in the inequalities produced by the mathematical structures of the world, as identity is found in the equalities which they establish. Equal ratios involve unequal quantities, and equal quantities involve unequal ratios. And as regards being, perhaps the status of the perceptible corporeal world as becoming genesis is what corresponds to the ungenerated being of the intelligible. The perceptible world, in conclusion, is an image of its intelligible paradigm in the sense that various aspects of the paradigm find expression in the world through the mediation, in particular, of mathematical structures. These mathematical structures, proportions, and shapes are fundamental to the order of the world, since they constitute soul and body. It is through them that the world, as a living animal, can image its intelligible paradigm. If the mathematical structures are the means whereby the perceptible world can become an image of the intelligible model, then they are not part of the model. These structures are required because the features of the intelligible model cannot simply be duplicated in the world. And this is so, I believe, because the world is perceptible, corporeal, generated. The world will have features corresponding to features of the intelligible model, not identical to those of the model, but similar in the sense that they are produced by mathematical structures which serve to map out features of the intelligible world on the landscape of the indeterminate receptacle and its chaotic motions in which the world is made. It would then be in this sense that the world is an image of its intelligible model. As a final word, I would like to add a passage taken from Plato's Laws, which comes near, I think, to the theme of this paper. If we say that both intellect and motion in one place move in relation to the same tauta and in the same way and in the same and around the same and to the same and in one relation and one order, and that all this is imaged by the motions of a well-rounded sphere, we would not at all seem to be poor craftsmen of beautiful images in words. The outer sphere of the outer surface of the sphere is equally distant at all points from its center, Aristotle, but also Plato in the footnote. This equality is an image of the identity to which intellect relates, and so do the equalities which bind the world of the Timaeus make it an image of the identity in its intelligible model. Thank you very much for your patience. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. So, thank you, Dominic. So let's open the discussion. So if you have a question, so please write down your name on the chat window, or use the raise hand function, please. Okay. Satoshi Ogihara.
Yes.
Please. Okay.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. At Timaeus 37c, the Demiurge is satisfied to see the world that has been constructed so far, and wants to make it more like the model. So he creates time. And your account explains this scene extremely well. Of course, the initial project is sketchy, not determined fully. The architect continues to work out details as the construction goes on. And you have pointed out also that there may be some changes in the policy of construction during the process. So so it's striking. I wonder if you have any comments on this part of the Timaeus.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. This is very good. I'm very grateful to you. If we think of modern architectural practice, okay, today we would think of architects who plan very carefully the buildings that they're supposed to build. And everything, I think, is worked out on computer now. And you have virtual full-scale models of the building down to the last detail. And this is not at all the case for ancient Greek classical architecture. Scale models began to be used in the Hellenistic period, but before, there was a canon of architectural styles that was simple to understand and to visualize. And so they started off really with next to nothing. I think. Very something you can see even that an ordinary citizen can submit a project. And it seems to be that they were responsible, the architect who was employed to build the building, the temple, let's say. This architect had to follow through the whole project to the end, and he had to supervise the workmen. There was even a sub-architect to help him sometimes. And every phase of the building program had to be followed by him. And he continued planning, as you say. He planned as he went along. This sounds a bit chaotic, but and I think he worked in a progression from sort of preliminary sketches, we saw one, I think, to full detailed plans sketched on stone, which the workmen could follow in building. And probably, I think it did happen too, sometimes the architect changed his mind. And so, or maybe his plan was bad and then he had to alter his plan. And these things did happen. And of course, the fact that this could go on for over a century meant that, of course, you had different architects intervening. And so the passage you mentioned is very useful. Thank you very much. It fits in perfectly. Thank you. I'm very grateful. Another piece of evidence.
And Dr. Lena, so please ask a question.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, right.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting. I have two questions. The first, if I understood well, through the architectural analogy, you would construe like the Demiurge is like an architect in the Timaeus who is building the world like a house, so to speak. It reminds me, of course, of Aristotle. I think he uses this example of the architect in its distinction of the four causes, if I remember well, in the metaphysics and in the physics. I would just would like to know if you would, to what extent would you go with Proclus and interpretations like these to attribute to the different steps you identified, like could we say that the preliminary sketch that was the paradigm in the first sense would be the final cause, the young gods, the efficient cause in some sense, and the proportions given to the soul of the world and to the body would be like the formal cause, and do this allude to the paradigm in the second sense, in this prototype, and then maybe we could also identify the material cause, And so this would be my first question through this architectural analogy. And the second question would be about the fact that would you say that for Plato, if this architectural analogy is to a certain extent correct, the world isn't only like a kind of house, but is a temple. You mentioned it many times. So if the world is a temple, already for Plato, like it would be for Plutarch or Porphyry, does this stress the analogy he draws between philosophy and initiation or mystery, right? So we are, as philosophers, have to initiate ourselves in the temple, in this temple, which is the word actually, to elevate our souls. So that would be my two questions, and thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to answer quickly. With respect to the four causes, the Aristotelian four causes, I think I've noticed, without doing this systematically, I've noticed a little bit that you find this architectural vocabulary in Aristotle, and probably there's a lot more work to be done. For example, this idea of a preliminary sketch is used by Aristotle in the De Anima and also in the Ethics. And the idea is you start off with a sketch and then you fill it out. You fill it out with all sorts of things. And so I imagine our work could be done. But to come back to your four causes, my understanding is that this is speculative, okay? But I think in Plato's later works, he has the idea of skopos, a finality to be realized, the good. And I think this skopos is distinct from the model which allows you to realize the good. And this is very clear, I think, in the Plato's laws, but I think it's already in the Timaeus. So the Timaeus wants the Demiurge is good and wants to make something like him. He wants to make a good and beautiful world. And so I think he's got a skopos, which is to make a good world. But the way in which you make a good world, I think, is by using the best of models. And this would suggest a difference between the good as the final cause and the way in which you reach the good, the means. And if you want to talk about this in terms of formal causes, you might say the means are somewhat complicated because there's, first of all, the model, which sets out, you might say, the main lines that need to be followed in order to produce a world that is good. And then you have the mathematical structures which implement these main lines with respect to the receptacle. And so I think the formal cause is distributed, you might say, between the paradigm and the mathematical structures. If we want to read the Timaeus in Aristotelian terms, that's the way I think it could go. Is that okay just for your first question? And of course, a receptacle, but that's not really a material cause in the Aristotelian sense.
Yes.
The second question is the temple. I refer in the footnote of my text, which I think you can find in the compilation in footnote 2, to a reference to the world as agalma. And I was wondering if agalma means statue, but in fact, I think Cornford has an interesting commentary on this term, and he suggests that agalma means here a shrine for receiving divinity. And so I think we can go as far as to say that the world is divine, receives divinity, and in so much as the world is inhabited by the divine, and is a shrine. In that sense, there is room for, you might say, a sacred, a sacred concept of the world as bringing us to divinity. I think you can say that. I don't go as far as Proclus, but I think there is this element too. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Now, Dr. Altman, it's your turn.
I was very moved emotionally by your presentation, Professor Omiara. And I'm tempted to ask you about what it's like to grow old as an eminent Plato scholar. Like our hosts, I think, from your 1985 collection that gave a young Mitch Miller the chance to break our field wide open, you showed a generosity to allowing other people to say beautiful things that is reminiscent of our fine hosts. I recently had a conversation with a Demosthenes scholar. I asked him what his post-retirement project was, and he said he wanted to write a book, if he dared, about the sights and sounds of the Athenian judicial system. And it reminds me a little of your work in the sense that it's become real. So the turn to Realgeschichte, to the Wirklichkeit behind these metaphors. And I'm tempted to ask you if that's something that happens to all of us as we grow older, because I see it happening to myself. I saw it happening in him, and I see it in your paper. But the question I really want to ask you is, you cited wonderful texts about Timaeus using architectural imagery, and then closed with the Athenian stranger using architectural imagery. But I would like you to talk about Plato as the most important architect in the Platonic dialogues, and that the Platonic dialogues as a whole, and if you don't mind, I'll say all 35 of them, because of course in the Epinomis, he takes the number 12, he breaks it in half, he takes its two means at 8 and 9, and of course 6, 8, 9, and 12 add up to 35. And of course 35 is the age at which we graduate from dialectic in Book 7 of the Republic. And You were my happiest moment in this conference was when I heard you mention the syllables of my name. Thank you very much in your opening remarks. I really appreciate that. But I do believe that Plato wrote all 35 dialogues. And I do believe that they are what proves that Plato is exactly the kind of architect that you were describing. So I'd like you to, I mean, you can talk about the first part, the first question if you want, but I'd like to hear you talk about Plato as the greatest architect in the dialogues.
Oh gosh, this is another conference, I think. Just one or two words, if that's okay, because I think we're sort of running out of time. So yes, since retirement, I've at last been able to read, and I've thought that in order to know Plato better, you've got to know all about the arts and crafts that were practiced in Athens. And so I've been doing a lot of this. I've been reading a lot about architecture. I've gone into painting. I've gone into weaving. And I think it would be fun to do a kind of vocabulary of architecture, painting, weaving, metalworking as a key to reading Plato's Timaeus. But to be able to do this, you have to have time. You have to be able to read what the architectural historians are doing and all that stuff. So yes, I've done the same thing. I've at last been able to read a little widely than within the confines of the text. But I think Plato knows a lot about all of these things, and we don't. He knew a lot more than we do about how architects work, I think. Okay, Plato, oh, this is so huge. Obviously, the last passage that I quoted, the one from the Timaeus, talks about being a demiurge. We are demiurges in words. And we've had this theme already in the conference of words as images. And I don't want to spend any more time on that. We could talk forever about it, I think, but I obviously must agree that he is the supreme demiurge of words. And we could go on infinitely about how the dialogues can be structured and how we can find proportions within them. For instance, the Republic, how the form of the good just comes right in the middle and things like that. And we could probably work out proportions and things with respect to the composition of the dialogues. I certainly think he's a supreme artist, a supreme architect of words. But I don't think we have time to do justice to this theme, if that's all right with you.
Okay, now, so Professor Notomi, would you like to ask a question, please?
Yes. Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And I remember I attended some class of history of architecture in Cambridge, and I learned something, the actual construction and the failure of them. So it's interesting to put this argument in historical context. My question is more philosophical, I'm sorry. And near the end of your paper, the one point you propose is not, I'm quite sure about it, and that is the mathematical structure is not part of the model. You use mathematical structure, but what about mathematics or number? Is number a part of the model? Because the model, I think that the Demiurge's model contains at least the sameness, difference, and being. Yes. So, well, for example, it's interesting and crucial passage of the creating time in 37D. It says that the model is rest in one and any, and according to numbers, it's the contrast of one and number. So you suggest that mathematical structures are only device and means of structuring things, but I think that's mathematics already implied in the model. Mathematical structure maybe coming some later, but at least mathematics and numbers. I don't think we should distinguish, separate mathematicals out from the original image that, oh, sorry, original model. So that is my question.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Yes, there is a certain amount of speculation, and I'm driving the architectural image as far as I can in terms of its implications. I've already indicated that the Timaeus is much more complex than that, and the Demiurge is not just an architect. He does lots of other things too, and the world is not a temple; it's an animal. So there are all of these features, and so I don't want to say that this is the key to everything, but I think it does illuminate some things. And the implications for me concern the status of mathematical objects, which is a question we've already had. And obviously, I think the implication of the image is that mathematical objects are intermediaries and not forms. This is another way of going back to what Aristotle says about Plato. Or this is one way we might interpret the sense in which they are intermediaries. Now, what about numbers? Okay, well, what seems to happen is the Demiurge makes the soul stuff, as Cornford calls it, and then he cuts off a section, a moira, and I interpret this as establishing the module, the metron. And it's from this metron, the moira, that he then creates geometrical progressions by doubling and tripling the module, the metron, so he gets symmetriae, okay? So proportions are generated by starting with a module, let's say 1, and then doubling it and tripling it. So I think this operation generates number, in fact, or we're talking about numbers here. This operation, I think, is part of what it is to realize the model in the receptacle, or realize the model at least in making soul. So I see number as, in fact, what the Demiurge generates by taking a measure and then by creating series from that measure by operations of doubling and tripling. These are very simple arithmetical procedures. And in that sense, I hesitate to say that numbers are already in the forms, among the forms. There are implications, of course, in my approach to what the forms are too, and what things are their forms. There are implications there too. And of course, I've gone so far as to be daring and to talk about the good, which in a sense is here too. But the phrase katarismon that we find, that doesn't necessarily mean according to number, it can mean according to proportion. So I think what happens is this, the heavens are made, okay? And the heavens are structured in terms of these geometrical proportions, okay? And arithmetic and harmonic proportions. And so these spheres are moving around according to, you might say, the rhythm. There's not only metron, there's also rhythmos. And they move according to rhythm. And this rhythm of the heavenly movements, I think, are the source of human mathematics. We observe the rhythms of the movements of the heavens, and from that we learn mathematical things. Do you see what I mean? So I'm just pushing my argument.
Yeah, you clarify your point. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Next, Dr. Andre Krasa, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk, and I would like to hear more about. So I think you have shown excellently how fruitful it could be to look at the Demiurge as a architect. And my question is whether you see also some dark side of considering Demiurge as an architect. And I would have one suggestion, which is that some interpreters like Brody or Ostenfeld have considered the modal imitation scheme in the Timaeus quite, I think, literally, and they say that the modal has its meaning and is meaningful because it is imitated by the world. That it's paradigm in a sense of blueprint of the world. And maybe the architectural explanation as you provided it might someone lead in this direction, that the model has not its own meaning, has its not own essence, but it is just a blueprint for the world. And I would like to hear your comments about this and whether you see other probable misleading aspects of the architectural explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an excellent question. I'm very, very lucky to get such good questions. And I hope my answers are worthy of them. There are misleading elements of this architectural image, and I think we have to be very careful. And this is why I want to suggest it's not the only way of reading the Timaeus. There are lots of other things involved. Among the misleading aspects I would mention would obviously be the thing that would be the idea that the architect thinks up the model. And the implication of this would then be that the demiurge invents the forms, so to speak, and that the forms are simply the architect's planning or blueprint, if you like. I think that's pushing the image too far. I think with Plato, you shouldn't push images beyond a certain limit. And you can't read them in a really scholastic way where everything has to be, you know, transferred. And I think to go as far as to say the demiurge invented the forms because he wanted to make a beautiful world, I think that's going far too far. I don't think we can go that far. I don't think it's not the sense I get of the Timaeus. So it may be that human architects invent models to make beautiful buildings, but I don't think it follows that the demiurge invented the forms in order to make a beautiful world. But I would like to insist that when we use the word paradigma, we have to be careful. I know of at least 4 different senses of the word paradigma. But I think one distinction I want to make is between paradigma as a sort of a preliminary project and paradigma as a prototype. And so I don't think the forms are prototypes, okay? But by saying that they form part of a preliminary sketch doesn't mean that they are just fabricated by the demiurge or that they don't have I think they have a full-blooded reality. They are the only ones that have a full-blooded reality, so to speak. I don't know what to make of the demiurge himself. There's another problem there, is who is the demiurge? What is he? How does he relate to the forms? How does he relate to the good? And all that. And I think when you try to come up with dogmatic answers to these questions, I think you're abusing of Plato's use of these various images.
Okay, now Kyung-ho, so you have the floor.
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
yes, I'm Korean doctoral student in Germany, so thank you for your inspiring and interesting presentation. So my question is concerning Plato's political thought in this context. So you have mentioned in your presentation the Plato's or Platonic or Aristotelian political art as having an architectural character.
Yes.
So after I listened to your presentation about architectural image in Timaeus, so I think that it can be reasonable to say that politicians or lawgivers, or their activities operate in a similar or in a such a similar or identical way that divine architecture built the world. So at this point, my question is whether you'd have any idea regarding what can be the corresponding analog of disorderly or indeterminate raw material the architect ordinarily use in the process of politics. So that is my question.
Yes, thank you very much. Very quickly, I think, Euree, we have to be careful that the next session is coming up, but the final address. But very quickly to your answer, to your question, sorry. The obvious dialogue of Plato in this respect is the statesman, where the political science has an architectonic function with respect to subordinate functions such as that of the rhetor and the judge and the general. So you can see there are different skills, and they all are at the service of political science, just as the architect has various craftsmen, bodies of craftsmen who are at his service for producing the building. What is the chora in politics? What is this disorderly, irrational milieu to which order has to be brought? Maybe with the use of mathematics again, as in Plato's laws. I'd imagine it's the human soul, the irrational drivings of the human soul, desire, and you know, all of these chaotic motions that characterize us as human beings, our souls, desires, need to be given some kind of structure, some sort of order. And so I think that the short answer would be to say it's the human soul, which is, so to speak, the chora in which the political scientists and politicos will bring order. Is that sure? Okay, as an answer.
So unfortunately, it's time to close our session. So I would like to express my gratitude to the speaker and the audience for participation. Now it's over to Professor Gang.